The wind howled as a prince was dragged from his home to become a hostage. But not even he knew that the military superpower called Thebes that he was being surrendered to would later surrender to him. But first, the prince's country was on the cusp of annihilation, both financially and militarily. And his brother, the king, was not long for this world. Philip II was the name of that hostage prince, and he was nobody. The youngest son of the second wife of a dead king. He was alone, and nothing more than currency being used to ensure a temporary peace for his backwater nation of Macedonia. As he was carted away from his home, Philip decided that he wasn't always going to be a nobody forever. He was going to climb his way to the top of the world, and he was going to do it alone. In Thebes, he was forced into the care of the father of Epaminondas, who had defeated the Spartans and ensured the Thebans had hegemony over Greece. There, Philip managed to glean knowledge from this acclaimed general. And even though he was a hostage, he was able to find information on the Theban sacred band and their military tactics, taking quiet note of how they were equipped and how, as a professional force, they were essentially unmatched on the battlefield. Philip spent 3 years as a hostage in Thebes before escaping back to his homeland. His home had changed. His older brother, the king, was assassinated, replaced by a regent, who was then also assassinated and replaced by another of Philip's brothers. This brother was Perdiccas III, and he recognized the ability Philip exhibited and so sent his younger brother off to rule his own region. There, he got his first true experience as a commander. And there, he applied what he had learned in Thebes and began the biggest gamble of his life thus far. He started to form his war machine. Inspired by the Theban sacred band, which used a 12-foot spear instead of the typical 8-foot spear the rest of the Greeks used, he designed a new weapon, an 18-foot spear called the sarissa. It would give his men tremendous reach, letting them kill before anyone could ever touch them. But this weapon had never before been tested in real battle. Additionally, he equipped his men with lighter armor and smaller shields, so they could better carry their own supplies. This could make his army the most mobile force in Greece, but it could also make them vulnerable in battle. And finally, just like the Theban sacred band, he didn't enlist his soldiers for a season. He brought them into service permanently. War would be their only vocation, but this would cost him money. Money he didn't have. Philip's brother, King Perdiccas III, engaged in war against Macedonia's generational enemies, the Illyrians, but fell in battle along with 4,000 Macedonian soldiers. Before he died, Perdiccas III assigned Philip as regent for his son. Philip II wasted no time. He convened a Macedonian assembly, giving desperate speeches that temporarily restored the people's morale and convinced them that these dark times required an adult leader, himself. And so, he finally became king. But his problems were only beginning. Instead of worrying about his own survival, he was now fighting for an entire nation. This nation, just like him, was alone, and this nation was surrounded by and fully infested with enemies. To his east, 2 neighboring countries were looting and pillaging his lands. To his north, Illyria had claimed the territory Perdiccas couldn't defend, and were planning to invade even farther into Macedonia. And on his coast was an army that included 3,000 Athenian hoplites supporting a pretender to his throne. All of this weight was bearing down on Philip, but he responded with alacrity. To begin with, he took on his first wife, a princess of the Illyrians, and concluded a treaty with them that he hoped would keep them at bay just long enough. Then he sent diplomats to Athens, while gathering his troops and testing their mettle by pushing the looters out of the eastern portion of his country and keeping them out with promises of tribute. Finally, he confronted the army supporting the pretender, defeating them in battle but releasing the Athenian portion of the army, giving gifts and treating them with kindness. He did not want war with the naval superpower of the world. Not yet. The diplomats he sent to Athens assured them that he would pull his troops out of a coastal city called Amphipolis, which turned out to be the only reason they involved themselves with the pretender to Philip's throne in the first place. This city happened to control several gold and silver mines of immense value that had gone largely unexploited. Then he got word that a nearby country had just lost their king. So Philip took this opportune moment to strike with his army, simultaneously binding his army closer to himself with a clear victory, adding rich territory to his country, and increasing his own personal wealth. You see, he was facing the problem that had plagued every Macedonian king before him. The fact that every noble in the country saw the king as no more than first among equals. But with an army personally loyal to himself, and more money than any of those nobles, Philip was separating himself from that reality bit by bit. Philip returned home, and just like that, he had dealt with every immediate military threat except for one. It was time to set his sights on the generational bane of his country. They had defeated his father, Amyntas III, who only returned to his throne with the help of the Thessalians. They had killed his brother and 4,000 Macedonian men. They had stolen the northwest portion of Philip's country. They were the Illyrians, and Philip refused to let them continue to bully his people, his country, and himself. He set forth with 10,000 of his newly trained infantrymen and 600 heavy cavalry of a style that he designed himself. As he approached the hated Illyrians, their 90-year-old king, Bardialis, sent diplomats to stop his in-law. He proposed that Philip go home with what he had and not try to take from Illyria what they had won. Philip refused. This battle was his true testing ground. It would determine if he had any of the qualities necessary to do more than just survive. The battle commenced. Facing the Illyrian army of 10,000 infantry and 500 cavalry, this was also the first true test his experimental army would have to endure. And endure, they did. Remembering the Theban tactics in war, Philip II gathered the best men he had about him and charged straight into the right flank of his enemy. They had formed up in a large square formation to counter his more numerous cavalry. Philip's sarissa-wielding soldiers clashed with the middle of the square, but as in so many battles before between the two peoples, the Illyrians began to push the Macedonians back. Death and wounds abounded on both sides. But the Illyrians were defeating Philip's war machine. Philip began to fight in a reckless fashion, not caring about being wounded or even if he survived. This was about more than survival. In doing this, he caused them to make a single mistake. The Illyrians let themselves be distracted by Philip. This allowed Philip's cavalry to swing around them and attack them in their flanks and rear. The press of Philip's cavalry on their rear and his insane fighting in their front prevailed. The Illyrians fled, their king Bardialis was reported dead, and the histories say that 7,000 of their number died that day. Philip returned to Macedonia, not just as the defender of his home, but as the victor over the people that neither his older brother nor his father had been able to resist. And he had proven to himself once and for all that maybe, just maybe, he could do more than just survive. The year was 357 BC, and Philip's next course of action was to marry Olympias, a princess of Epirus, thus securing his western border with a strong alliance. This left one last problem that threatened his nation's survival: the financial crisis of his country. And in doing so, he would find himself engaged in wars of a scale that dwarfed those he had seen so far. To remedy the financial problem, he looked at the political climate of his southern neighbors, the Greeks. They were involved in the social war, in which many of Athens' allies and vassals were rebelling against its authoritarian reign. The social war was only a prologue to the great Greek sacred war that would grab even Philip into its bloody clutches. Philip, unaware, took advantage of Athens' current predicament with glee. Knowing they were distracted and too busy to worry about him, he marched for Amphipolis, the city he had given to them earlier. There he constructed many great siege towers and rams, and eventually broke a hole into their wall that led to the city's capture. Once in charge, he had control of the gold and silver mines necessary to make him the wealthiest man in Macedonia. And so began the war with Athens. But they didn't realize it just yet. He sent messengers to them, saying that he would give them Amphipolis in return for another city called Pydna that was close to his capital. The Athenians agreed, and so did nothing when he marched into that city and took it as well. When Philip didn't pull his garrison from Amphipolis, however, the Athenians realized they'd been tricked, fully taken advantage of, and had come out of the situation that much weaker. As the result, they declared formal war. Philip II had brought his country from the edge of destruction to the edge of fame. But his ambitions were much bigger than that. So he responded to their declaration with energy and ingenuity. He marched south after Pydna, reaching a city that was more important to Athens than any ally, a city populated by the Athenian people themselves. He took the city unhindered, taking full advantage of the distraction provided by the social war, but released the Athenian citizens without mistreating them. What he did with the city, called Potidea, was different only in scale to something he'd done many times before. He used the city as a bribe. He turned it over to the Chalcidian League, headed by a city called Olynthus. This bought their loyalty from Athens and secured his country against the only true presence the Greeks had, close to his territory. But there was still an Athenian fort that could be leveraged against him, and so he found himself marching for the city of Methone. With the social war over and the sacred war only beginning, Athens was able to send a bit of aid to this city to stop Philip. But they only managed to drag it out longer. As he prepared for the siege, Philip got word of his former teacher and captor Thebes. The Greek superpower had been politically and militarily outmaneuvered by a city called Phocis. This city had shocked the entire Greek world by forcibly taking control of the Temple of Delphi. There, they had looted its stockpile of treasure that had been built up by decades of Greek donations and used it to hire an army of mercenaries. Athens, Philip's current foe, had sided with the temple-robbing Phocians. With this knowledge weighing down on him, he used siege ladders, towers, and rams to breach the walls. The operation commenced. Philip was ready to join his troops in the battle. But fate had other plans. He fell to the ground before he ever reached the walls. His face was burning with excruciating pain. His men dragged him away from the battle, shielding him. Surgeons were scrambled to his side. They removed an arrow that should have killed him, but they couldn't save his eye. Philip was enraged. He reportedly ordered that any means of escape for his troops be removed. This forced his army to fight with the mania that only cornered dogs have. And when he finally took control of the fortress, he ejected its inhabitants with only one set of clothing each before razing the city to the ground. During this time, Philip had received word from his long-standing allies, the Thessalians, masters of the horse, that they were getting annihilated by Anamarchus, the general of the Phocian mercenary army. Philip, now one-eyed and the father of a young Alexander, marched south and faced the Phocians in battle not once, but twice. There, Philip tasted his first defeats. He was outmaneuvered, outsmarted by Onimarchus, and his enemy was equipped with catapults, a technology that most of the world had never even heard of. He was forced to retreat out of the country, but he left with a promise. He said, "I did not flee, but I am receding like a ram, to butt again the harder." And return he did. Styling himself as the avenger of Apollo, he dressed his troops in holy laurels and marched into battle with Onimarchus a third and final time. This battle would determine whether Philip had learned from his defeats. It would determine who would be the ultimate victor of the war, him or Athens. And finally, it would determine whether or not Philip would fade back into being nobody again. His army this time consisted of 20,000 foot soldiers and, with the Thessalians swelling his ranks, 3,000 cavalrymen. They were facing an army of 20,000 infantry, but only 500 cavalry. The numbers seemed to give Philip the advantage, but there was an Athenian fleet just off the shore, threatening to turn the tide of battle against Philip at any moment. The two armies lined up across from each other, the Athenian fleet waiting, threatening, in the background. The Phocians saw Philip's men wreathed in laurels, heard that Philip was the avenger of Apollo, a god many of them respected, and some couldn't take it. They dropped their weapons, they ran. Some even surrendered themselves to the Macedonians. But this wasn't enough to prevent the slaughter that would ensue. Philip's men charged, slamming into the Phocian lines. The fighting was fierce, but it very quickly became one-sided. When Philip's cavalry overwhelmed their numerically inferior opponents and crashed into the Phocian infantry, the mercenary army crumbled. They ran for their lives to the sea, and then they swam for their lives, abandoning weapons and armor in their mad rush to get to the Athenian fleet, their only hope of escape. Philip's cavalry proved its effectiveness here, slaughtering 6,000 of the fleeing mercenaries and aiding in the capture of 3,000 more, including Onimarchus the general. As the avenger of Apollo, Philip had Onimarchus crucified, and the 3,000 mercenaries, he drowned them to death. And so Philip returned like a budding ram to win the bloodiest battle in Greek history up to that point. And the man who lost his eye at Methone was immediately elected King of Thessaly. He had dealt an irrevocable blow to Athens, proved he could learn from his defeats, and had shown the world that he wasn't fading into being a nobody again. He wasted no time, however, instead marching south with haste toward the city of Phocis, the source of the rebellion. But he was stopped at the pass of Thermopylae. It was a coalition army of Athenians and their allies. Instead of repeating the mistake of the Persians, he simply turned his army back north, returning to Macedonia, where a new problem had arisen. The Chalcidian League, that he had bought and paid for an alliance with earlier in his life, by giving them the conquered city of Potidaea, had suddenly sided with Athens. To add insult to injury, they were protecting a pair of Philip's half-brothers, evidently planning to replace him on the Macedonian throne with these lesser men. Philip demanded that the Olynthians, the leaders of the league, turn his brothers over and forget the Athenians. They refused. Athens cheered. Philip reacted. Using a mixture of his favorite tactics, bribery, diplomacy, and destruction, he rapidly took the cities of the league one by one until 32 were his, and only Olynthus, the lead city of the league, was left. This city proved to be stalwart and strong, costing Philip many men and even forcing him to change tactics. He resorted to a combination of all three favored tactics, convincing a pair of Olynthian commanders to accept a bribe in return for making an opening for his troops. Finally, Olympus was his, and knowing that Athens was watching, he sold every living person into slavery and burned the city down. The message was successfully delivered. Athens was terrified. They begged for peace. At the same time, Thebes, the former masters of Philip, also sent diplomats to him, unaware that they were asking for their doom. They asked Philip to pass through Thermopylae and finally end the sacred war against the Phocians. Philip was ecstatic. He concluded a peace treaty with Athens, thereby forcing them out of the sacred war and leaving the Phocians alone in their war effort. He marched south, this time without resistance, and accepted the immediate, unconditional surrender of the Phocians. From there, he arranged for the Phocian votes in the Amphictyonic Council, a religious union that bonded all the main Greek city-states, to be given to him. Thus, Macedonia was officially recognized as a Greek state. Philip was king, he was rich, his army was unmatched, his country was recognized as Greek, and Athens was stewing in fear that was boiling into hatred for him. Aware of this, he moved north, taking city after city and adding more and more territory to Macedonia. But when he began to siege the cities that were the main sources of grain to Athens, they sent aid overseas that forced him to give up. This was the opening he needed. He marched south, ready to put an end to Athenian resistance once and for all. He stationed his army in a key city that controlled roads flowing south to Thebes and Athens, causing them to panic and side together against Philip. This was it, the final battle that would seal Philip's status as either Philip II of Macedonia or Philip II, King of Greece. Philip's army was 32,000 strong, with 2,000 of that number being cavalry. His foes, the allied Athenians and Thebans, fielded an army of 35,000 and held the advantageous defensive position. They were just outside the city of Chaeronea. They had mountains to their left and a river to their right, which protected their flanks from Philip. Philip put his son Alexander, now 17 or 18, in charge of his left flank, then took his usual position on the right. He ordered his middle and left flanks to stay where they were, and marched his soldiers on the right forward, alone. The Athenians were his opponents on this flank. The soldiers clashed, and the brawl lasted all throughout the morning. Only on the right flank, however, was any fight happening. The soldiers up and down the flanks on both sides remained still, watching Philip's men slowly eat through the less experienced Athenians. But as the Athenians began to tire to the point of exhaustion, Philip retreated. His men pulled back, and the warriors of Athens charged. Alexander, at the same time, ordered the middle and left flanks to begin a slow advance toward the Thebans. A gap opened as the Athenians moved farther and farther from the rest of their troops. At this sight, the rest of Philip's army lurched forward. Alexander and the companion cavalry raced across the battlefield to push through that opening. As Alexander threaded the metaphorical needle, Philip and the right flank halted. They turned to face the approaching Athenians. They charged. The battle was renewed. Now everyone was completely engaged in a battle to the death. Everyone but Alexander. He and the companion cavalry swung around the flank of the allied army, using the hole so graciously provided by his father and the unwitting Athenians. The cavalry slammed into the Theban flank with ferocity. The allied army crumbled. Everyone was running for their lives, throwing down their weapons and armor to run faster, or begging for good treatment. Everyone but the Theban sacred band. They fought long after they had been completely abandoned. They fought until almost every one of them was dead. And when Philip II came across their corpses on the battlefield, he wept. How far he had come. From prisoner and student of Thebes, to ally and leader of Thebes, to the conqueror of Thebes. With the conclusion of the Battle of Chaeronea, Philip effectively elected himself hegemon and commander-in-chief over a unified Greece, including a cowed Athens. Philip hadn't let a single challenge, no matter how insurmountable, stop him. He had fought through every adversity, and as the result, he went from worthless hostage to king of civilization.